We didn't anticipate the boom of AI right now. I mean, some people may have a year or two before, but not to this
Not
extent.
more than that, for
And if you
sure.
look back at the big plans for companies in the last 30 or 40 years, they've all been rocked by developments nobody anticipated, right? So, planning is way overrated, right? And figuring out how we manage uncertainty is something we can do, but it's
Hmm.
just not as simple and it doesn't sound as cool as just planning.
Hello to all our listeners to another fabulous episode of EDU Unlocked with me, Ashish Fernando, your podcast and host for this show. And here at this show, we talk to inspirational leaders in higher education. And our goal is to give you not just the background of how things work at an institution, but actually the background of these leaders and how they actually shape their lives and careers to dedicate most of their lives to the student who's at the end the center of most of our conversations, the workplace, the institution, and staff. And so joining us today is one such really inspirational personality. I'm fortunate enough to have Dr. Peter Cappelli with us on this podcast. Welcome, Dr. Cappelli.
Thank you.
Just I'm gonna do my best. I mean, yours is an inspirational 4 decade long career. It you cannot use words to justify that, but I'm gonna try my introduction of
Okay.
Dr.
Sure.
Cappelli. So Dr. Cappelli works with the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, extremely highly ranked and prestigious institution that a lot of business students wanna go and attend and graduate from. And he's a George Taylor Professor of Management at the school. He also serves as the director of Wharton's Center for Human Resources. So today we're going to talk a lot about the workplace, people management, a lot of those things. So if any of you have any of those backgrounds, this is the podcast you want to listen to. He's not just teaching and serving at the institution, but he does a lot of research. He writes a lot about everything from resource management, labor economics, employment policy. Has a key voice, not just in the United States, but also globally. He has an international presence, and he serves on different boards, people doing policy everywhere from the Kingdom of Bahrain, where he's worked. He's worked with the Ministry of Singapore. I mean, this is just amazing. And he usually also attends. I'm guessing you're there most of the time at the World Economic Forum as well, right?
Used to be.
Used to. Okay. Okay. But all of that's 40 years of hard work and dedication to this one topic that you've been working on. Tell us what inspired you to work on this relentlessly for 40 years.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction. I wouldn't say that I've been working on anything even like the same thing. So
Okay.
my doctoral thesis was about inflation and wage-related inflation, and almost as soon as I finished it, wage inflation kind of disappeared. So, you better do
You're like,
something
wow,
else.
all my work.
Yeah, yeah. So I was in England then, and I came to the US and to MIT and into a project about trade unions and what was happening there. And I spent, maybe 8 years or so looking at what was going on with trade unions, which unfortunately for them was a period of collapse. So
Mm.
not unlike my thesis, you had to go find something else to work on after that. But I was interested in policy sort of from my graduate training on. And there are these little events that happen in your life, especially earlier on, that sometimes change your direction. So one of the executive MBA students at Wharton was a woman named Anne McLaughlin, who became Secretary of Labor.
Yeah, yeah.
And she asked some folks at Wharton to come and help her think about what she wanted to do in, if assuming there was a second term for her, spending the first term ramping up and what do we want to do and dealing with the day-to-day stuff and what kind of agenda. So I worked on that. And then it turned out she didn't have a second term. So we produced a big report, but it was laying out, what should be done with respect to the workforce in the US. And from there, I was sort of pulled into a project for the Department of Education, which at that time didn't give research grants per se. They created centers. And so we competed for a research center that would be at the University of Pennsylvania on the educational quality of the workforce was the title of it. And so I spent with my colleague Bob Zebskian, who was in the ed school and really is a higher ed guy, although he's retired now, still seems to be busy. We looked into these questions of, what is shaping the quality of the workforce in the US. And, the big story there, which had been ignored in the education world, is employers. What do they look for? Who do
Yeah.
they hire? Do they train people or not? Do they pay for people to go back to school? Do they empower employees? They really control, it turns out, most everything. So we spent about 8 years positioning that story, basically trying to get policymakers to think more about what's going on with employers. And, we had, I'd say, some influence at the margin there. That center started to fade out and was combined with another one on higher education. And there the issue was much more up the line of your podcast here. And so we spent another 6 years or so working on those questions from the higher education angle, but looking at higher education and employment and workforce issues. So that took me well through the 1990s, about 2000 or so. And then I actually got more interested in what you might think of as human resource issues because of these policy issues, right? Some of it's because I had to teach that stuff at Wharton, but some of it is because the employer decisions and the practices of companies, end up being profoundly important for people as employees, but also for the economy. So that's how I sort of navigated around there. I sort of fell between different disciplines in some ways. And once you get tenure, it doesn't matter so much. You can write about what you want. And there seemed to be a pretty big vacuum of people not talking much about how companies are actually managing people. So that's kind of where I landed.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. So it's not where you started, but it was kind of so would it be fair to say it's a combination of what you were passionate about, but also where you thought the opportunity was. So you had to be a little flexible there.
Yeah, it's really where the opportunity was. And I don't think you see that often in academics so much because we come out molded into a particular paradigm. And
Yeah.
the traditional career is you replicate things in that paradigm, right? And my initial paradigms kind of disappeared, like the study of inflation, the study of trade unions and things kind of disappeared, right? So I was caught a little between, and that made it easier to go to where things were actually happening. And I think in the social sciences, we sometimes lose sight of the fact that we're not curing cancer in the same way. It's not like we have an objective set of problems that nature has thrown to us.
Sure.
We have problems that are in society, and we ought to try to address those, or at least write about them. So it's made it
Sure.
easier to follow what's topical.
But I mean, it's still a very systemic issue. Yes, it's not health related, but employment and everything around that and how institutions connect to employers is something that, I mean, for the last decade or so, so many people have been trying to work on it, right? The whole jobs for the future construct of can we build skills at the institution that actually make people job ready? But it's also so hard. I mean, suddenly there's Web3 and then now there's AI, and then there's something else. And like, how do you, yeah.
Well, I think there is something important maybe for listeners to understand about this context. And that is one of the biggest things that's happened since I began my career is the rise of an industry that supports employment and supports human resources broadly defined. And this industry is enormous. So one of my former students and I just totaled up the size of it the companies that provide staffing services or benefit management or all that sort of stuff. And you look at them together, you add them up, you might just mentally try to guess how big you think this is. And I guarantee you guess too small. It's $1.9 trillion per year. And out of that, they spend typical marketing budget is about 10%. So they're spending $190 billion a year on marketing. And a lot of
Wow.
marketing is persuading you that there are problems and that we have solutions to them, right? So the agenda and all this future of work stuff is largely driven by the vendors, many of whom have
Hmm.
solutions they would like to sell you, and they have problems they would like to sell you as well. And so,
Sure.
the issues are often kind of distorted. We ended up often chasing things which are not really problems, at sometimes at the expense of real problems, but they're just ones the vendors aren't so interested in. Like how do we hire well? How do we train? The basic nuts and bolts stuff we haven't spent as much time on. We end
Yeah.
up chasing things which are much more ephemeral for sure.
Understood. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's great. Now, question. If you've been at UPenn doing this for most of your career,
Yeah.
would it be different for you to do it outside of a higher ed institution, like as your own practice, or like working with government directly? Like, what made you choose to stick around there and do this?
Uh, well, I suppose if you were really interested in making money, you could go into that vendor space, right?
Hmm.
I'm sure, it's quite lucrative. Those companies are making lots and lots of money, right? So you could go in that direction. I wasn't particularly disposed to hustling for money and things, it wasn't my comparative advantage, I didn't think. So I didn't do that for sure. There are different institutions that have different kinds of focus. I think what Wharton gives you as an audience in the business community, which is big. And it's turned out in the last 20 or 30 years, the business community has all the marbles, as it were, right? They have all the power and influence. Government thinks
Yeah.
business is more important than it probably is. They think businesses have more answers than they actually do. So you could have done a lot worse. If I had been in a school of education or something, you would be struggling to get an audience.
Hmm.
And, because the higher ed community looks to the business community for guidance and advice and direction and things to worry about, right? So in that sense, it was fortuitous. But it also meant that I wasn't exactly surrounded by people interested in the same things, right? So that was probably not such a plus.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, that's clear. And there'll be people who have that question for themselves is, hey, do I do things inside of higher ed or walk out? Because a lot of times, so like when I started iSchool 6 years ago, I said, oh yeah, everybody's looked at they've come in, started their careers in education and then looking at technology.
Mm.
I actually came in with technology and then I'm looking at higher ed because I'm passionate about it.
Hmm.
Right. It's like my grandfather started 7 schools, and so education runs in the family. And I got early exposure to machine learning and AI before it was even cool, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I said, oh, but I see a lot of potential in higher ed. Soon to realize that higher ed also does not move as fast as like a retail or manufacturing or something else. So you might have an idea that you think is super candid and it'll help, but
Hmm.
implementing and deploying that takes time. And by the time you actually get to deploy it, there's something new.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, and that's why I asked you that question is, I always think about it as, okay, hey, how will it be if I was not involved in higher ed? Would I do things faster somewhere
Hmm.
else?
Hmm.
And my passion is what keeps me within higher ed is I want to help the
Yeah.
student, it runs in the family and all of that.
Yeah, and I think the question is whether you want to be an individual contributor. Higher education is great for that. The
Yeah.
problem with being an individual contributor is you don't have much leverage. If you want leverage, you have to have people who work for you, and that's harder to get in higher ed. I mean, you can do it.
Mhm.
It means, you're also raising money all the time rather than spending your time thinking, right? So yeah, it's a
True.
different choice in higher education.
True. Yes. Yeah, and it's not necessarily about building value outside, it's more about building fast. Y- uh,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
you're right. And especially if it's an investor-backed business, and there's way more focus on profitability and scale than there is on intrinsic value for the
Yeah.
company. So yeah,
And
absolutely.
let's not kid ourselves about truth, right? I mean, you can
Yeah.
make lots of money from things which are not true. And
Yes.
it's being demonstrated every day. Now, if you're interested in what is true, that narrows the range of things you can be interested in, right?
Yeah, yeah. So that's, I think that's a good sort of high level insight on higher ed versus non-higher ed. Like, yeah, if people want to focus on one. Since you're very much involved with human resources and structuring and companies, uh, would love to hear your thoughts about the post-COVID workplace. You've written about it in a few of your articles.
Mhm.
During COVID, everybody thought this is gonna be the default way of working, hybrid or mostly work from home. A lot of companies post-COVID are bringing back the work from office culture,
Yeah,
right? It's
yeah.
partly driven by a percentage of employees who just wouldn't work when they're at home, and there's a lot of like emotional stress because they're not meeting each other. What are your thoughts in terms of like 5 years down? Where do you think it's going to settle and why?
Yeah, well, we're actually working on a book on exactly that question. I wrote a book at the beginning of the pandemic in 2021, which was really based on research that had been done about remote workers before then. Remote work starts in the 1970s, actually. And, it begins with this idea that, gee, our cities are awfully congested. If we could get people to move away a little bit and work from a distance, and maybe we could do this with computers eventually, but it originally was with telephones, which is why the government still refers to this as telework, because it
Telework, yeah.
began with telephone lines as the basis of this. I think, the remote work was before COVID something that was kind of a perk for people. And I think the evidence on it, though, suggested that if you were somebody who was working remotely and your colleagues were not, everything ends up work-wise worse for you. You are
Mhm.
less engaged, you have fewer connections, you don't do as well in your work, you don't get promoted as fast, you don't get the pay increases, you're much more likely to quit. Pandemic was different, right? Because everybody was home and it was not a stigma in any way for you to be at home because everybody was. I think the I think the question has become this one. Companies
Mhm.
waited so long to say anything about what they wanted to do that it became the
Mhm.
new normal. So early on in the
Yeah.
pandemic, companies were saying, okay, we're going to be back by July of 2020. And then they said, okay, well, then Labor Day. And then they said, okay, how about Labor Day 2021? And that was not their fault, right? It was because we kept having these new waves of infections.
Yeah.
But then they stopped saying anything about it. And so, the average job tenure in the US is 4 years. The
Hmm.
pandemic started in 2020. So we have some people, average people in the workforce, who have only worked remotely. And so now, 4 years in, to tell people you want them to come back, taking something that they like away is quite difficult.
Yes.
And I think
Yeah.
that's the main thing that's holding it back now. It's also the case that employers did not have a very good sense as to how this was working. So it worked remarkably well during the pandemic. Partly our expectations were low. We didn't think it would work at all. And it worked way better than we thought. Individual contributors, it doesn't matter that much whether you're in the office or not. And there's evidence, the evidence about productivity and such that's all positive really comes from those jobs. The plus is you can
Mm-hmm.
measure productivity in those jobs well. The minus is they're not the most typical white collar jobs where you really don't need to see anybody.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the book that we're writing is in part based on some studies we did, focus groups going around talking to hybrid workers and trying to find out how work has actually changed. And there are things which are worse for the employer. The plus side is for employees. Most of them like it. Not everybody, though. And even the people who don't want to go back miss social relationships and contacts and connections in the workplace. But I think what we have learned, are learning now, is that there are all kinds of things that helped work get done before remote work, before COVID, when we were all in the office, that we just took for granted. And mainly
Mm-hmm.
that was social networks through which people got things done and little norms of reciprocity. You stop at my desk and ask me a quick question, I give you a quick answer. And then I later can ask you a quick question, I get a quick answer. To try to do that now, we have to schedule a Zoom meeting.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to do that. Or you just ping me and I don't reply because I don't know who you are anymore and we don't have any social connection. So it's made things more difficult in ways that we didn't easily notice. So,
Mm-hmm.
the trend has been to bring more people back. It hasn't been very fast, but that is the way the trend was going. There are pushes in the other direction, though. And one push we've already described is that people don't want to go back. But the other one we haven't thought much about is that in many organizations, maybe even most, when the pandemic started, a CFO cost-cutting move was to start shrinking the office space. So
Yes.
in lots of places,
Mm-hmm.
one of the reasons people don't want to go back to the office is their office is gone. They don't have an office anymore. So we've shrunk the office space. We've moved to hoteling, which means when you come in, you have a temporary desk.
Temporary desk.
And we've moved to open offices too, which means you can jam people in to compress spaces, like there is just a table and we're all sitting at a table. If you think about that in a pandemic world, that's a disaster, of course. Who thought this was a good idea? Well, somebody thinking only about costs. So one of the reasons why we're seeing less effort to bring people back is because the offices are gone. And I don't think
Mm.
we all understand that. And
Yeah.
hoteling, prior efforts with hoteling, people hated it. Open offices, we know people hate those. So we've moved toward two models that people hate. And now we're trying to bring people back to a different world. Their lives are settled on this other one. We've left them alone for 4 years. Not too surprising. It's hard to do.
That's really well said. Thank you for that elaborate explanation. I mean, yeah, and I've been experimenting a little bit as well, going slow, going by, with the whole back to work culture. Like we've started 3 weeks, 3 days a week from office, but we're also thinking through, what model works best. Like, do you give people Monday and Friday work from home? Because then they have sort of a longer period where they can, do some things
Yep.
with families, and then so yeah, really experimenting even with hoteling. Um, yeah, but all those tremendous things that you've said, like when you look at that open office setup that was so popular, like most of it felt like it was just to save space.
Oh, it is for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah. And the evidence on this is pretty clear. And one of the things we know is there's less communication in open offices. And if you've ever been in one,
yeah.
you walk in, everybody's got headphones on.
Headphones, that's right.
You're
Yeah,
sitting next to people, but you don't want to talk to them because then you're disturbing other people. So there's actually less conversation and contact that goes on.
yeah, yeah,
It's never worked well, but it's cheaper.
yeah.
And
Yes.
you're interested in cheap, that's what we're getting.
And talking about cheaper and connecting it to the labor force with the onset of AI today, of course, like it doesn't really work the way we think it will.
Yeah.
But if there's a world where with all this investment that's going in it, it actually becomes better, faster, and cheaper than human labor, then how do you see that shift happening in the workplace? Do you see companies using more and more of that, or the reliance on humans still going to be there? That's a big question that everybody's been asking, right?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things. There's an immediate practical problem, and that is the the rhetoric, we all know now, I think about the hype curve, when something is
Mm-hmm.
first introduced, we think it's incredible. One of the reasons for that with computer stuff, AI, large language models now, and generative AI, is because the people we hear from first are the people who've created the technology. And if you're in
Yes.
that world, it is remarkable the improvement. If you are somebody using it, it's not quite so remarkable. And if you start thinking about the work that has to get done, then uh, it's much harder to see that it is going to be quite so revolutionary. So we spent a fair amount of time thinking about this issue, and the way it looks now with, like with machine learning, which came first, machine learning is really useful, right?
Yes.
It is better at doing predictions than we are doing now, and we often have to make predictions on things like who should you admit for students, who's going to succeed,
Sure.
which employee should you hire, but it's not being used much at all. And the reason for that is it's really expensive to set up, right? And you have
Mm-hmm.
to have a lot of data to make it go. So there's something that really works and it's not being used because it turns out it's not easy or cheap, at least to set it up, and nobody wants to front the investment. There's another part of that, by the way, which I've discovered, and that is if you give somebody that information, like on hiring or probably on admissions too, people don't want to use it. They'd much rather go with their gut. So until you get to
Sure.
the point where you make people do it, it's not going to be just making it available, build it, they will not come, right? So I think on the large language model side, you don't have to build it. It's, the model is already there, right? So it's much easier to use, which is a great thing. But here are the problems in a nutshell. A lot of things that it could easily do don't need being done. The
Mm-hmm.
creators of this will tell you, this can easily handle all your correspondence back to customers and things, right? Well, what they aren't aware of is that no one writes those letters now. They're all form letters that go out to people. They have to be cleared by legal in advance. Could
Yes.
ChatGPT write them? Yes, it could. But they don't want ChatGPT to write them. It has to be looked at by lawyers first, and it would just complicate things. And there are other things that don't need to be done, like it could do better customer service than we're doing now with chatbots.
Mm-hmm.
But do businesses really want to provide better customer service? Often that means doing more things for customers, and they don't always want to do that. I'm sure many of your listeners are aware of the Air Canada experience with this, where they
Yes.
empowered the chatbots with ChatGPT, and they really did a nice job helping customers solve problems in ways that Air Canada didn't want them solved. Like,
Yeah.
sure, you can get refunds, we'll give you the discount here. And so
Uh-huh.
once you autonomize that, you don't necessarily want it, right? And I think, where it's really good is allowing us to do things we were not doing now. Before we start a project, let's do a quick study of it and what we think is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Or especially, let's look at our own internal data and analyze that. We've never done it because it's too hard to do to set it up. Now it's easier. Let's do that. All those are things we're not doing now. Really important, can be really useful. They don't cut current jobs because to cut a current job, you have to take over something somebody is doing right now. And
Yeah.
one of the things we also not paying attention to is that most employees have jobs that are multiple tasks involved in them. So
Mm.
if you think about computer programming, the evidence I've seen is the average programmer spends only 30% of their time writing code.
That's right.
They're
Yeah.
negotiating with clients, they're trying to figure out requirements, they're trying to see
Requirement
what's
gathering. Yeah.
possible, all that stuff, right? And so even if ChatGPT and the other providers. And as you probably know, some of this software was around before that would help you see code that's already been written. So you don't have to do it
Yes.
all yourself, right? It's not a completely new idea. But say it took over 30% of their work. You can't cut 30% of a person. Now you might say, well, we could cut 30% of a group, but only if they're put together like a typing pool. They're identical workers
Mm.
doing identical work. Then you could probably do it. You could just rearrange it until some people are fully booked and the other people have nothing to do, and
Or
you cut those
just
lines.
let them
But
out.
in
Yeah,
most cases, that's not the case. Like think about principals in school, for example, right?
sure.
Every school needs a principal. Now, if ChatGPT could do 30% of their work, which I don't think it could, but say it could, you can't cut 30% of each principal. And you don't want to combine, principals, one principal for three schools, right? So
Sure. Yeah.
um, so it's not going to take jobs, at least what we're seeing right now. It is useful, really useful, to help us do new things. And this may ultimately make us much more valuable and productive. And maybe in the longer run, it'll cut down the need for more jobs. That wouldn't be a terrible thing because we've just gone through a decade with the lowest productivity increase in US history. The
Yes. Yeah.
2010 through 2019, when we were looking at it last, productivity was like nowhere. And
Mm.
we need
Hmm.
productivity to be faster because
Yeah.
otherwise, if you want to double your company and there's no productivity growth, you got to double your workforce. You got to double the labor force in the country if productivity is not growing to double the economy. We want productivity growth. So it could be a great thing long
Yes.
term, not cutting jobs right now, at least that we can see.
Yeah. And I have a follow-up question on that. But
Sure.
before that, do you think that productivity slack is somewhere also connected to the COVID and post-COVID situation with work from home?
Well, we don't know a lot, right,
Yeah.
about particularly white collar work. We know that when you look at people who are individual contributors, their productivity is not down when they're working from home, but their
True.
hours of work seem to be longer. So
Hmm.
that seems to mean their performance is the same, but productivity's got to fall if you're doing the same amount of work in a longer period of time. Now, you might say, so what? As long as people are willing to work longer, and maybe that's true, right? I,
Hmm.
I think, at least from the student perspective, many of my colleagues at other universities and in other countries have noticed the problem of post-COVID students who have come into college and higher education less prepared
Yeah.
and especially less aware of how much work they have to do
Mm-hmm.
because
Yeah.
they didn't have to do very much in high school if you were taking remote classes and you weren't held accountable for much, right? And that is a problem, and you're starting to see it in the workplace because the COVID students are in the workplace now, the ones who were in college there, and you certainly hear those complaints from people. Is that temporary? Probably is temporary, but it matters. It does matter.
Understood. Yeah, fair point. And coming back to that AI question, now one thing I really believe in. I read this quote somewhere that said, "It's not AI that's going to take away your job. It's the person who builds the AI who will take away your job." And so it's important to think about everything from a reskilling angle. So, like when production became automated or banking became automated, it's not that people don't work in banks anymore. They still have employees. It's just that you have lesser and lesser people doing things like being a teller, like customer interactions, because a
Yeah.
lot of it is online.
Yeah.
So it kind of feels like we're in that transition state again, where people have to think of AI more from a reskilling angle than from a, oh, I'm going to lose my job angle.
Well, it is very difficult to predict. So if you think about bank tellers, the introduction of ATMs,
Yeah.
what happened is the demand for tellers went up. Now, that's a hard thing to swallow because everybody thought it would go
I
down.
did not know that.
The
Yeah.
reason it went up is because we found other things that tellers could do.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
even
Yeah.
just simply getting cash, you didn't have to go to a teller anymore for that, but there were other things they could do. And I think the skilling issue, I think, is not a problem here because
Mm.
the reason large language models will be so ubiquitous and kind of are, is it's not hard to use them. And could you take a class on how to, you could, but what really is important in knowing how to use large language models, relatively small amount of information required about them, but you really need to know the subject. in order to write these good prompts. And by the way, I would encourage all employers who are listening, don't hire people who say they're prompt engineers, hire librarians. And the reason for that is, first of all, librarians are not expensive and they know data. And they
They
know
know.
what data is good and what sources are lousy. And one of the things you have to figure out is what material you're going to use to train these models or to draw the information from, and how do you write good questions, right? They do that all the time, right?
Yeah, that's
So
right.
I don't think that it requires new skills to use large language models. And I think the problem is if it takes over your job, it isn't obvious and it's never been obvious where the new jobs will come from. You know, we've had a terrible track record in workforce development in trying to figure out what to train people for when jobs become obsolete. In manufacturing, we've run this experiment for 40, 50 years as manufacturing slowed down, assembly line work got less and less important. And you think about, okay, what are we going to do with these people? And, you know, it's hard to see.
Mm,
We overproduced beauticians for a long time, right? Lots of people who did that kind of work, and we had way too many of them, and they didn't have jobs for them. It's just really
right.
hard to predict. So, you
That's
know, the
right.
idea of reskilling is an engineer's kind of fantasy. It's a good one, you know, to think about that. We ought to figure out what we can do with these people, but the sense that it's a simple planning exercise, which we've heard in public policy forever. People think
Hmm.
it's just about planning. Figure out what you're going to need, and then poof, off we go, right? But then you
Yeah.
start thinking about how poorly our plans have gone. Great Recession knocked everything off for 5 years, didn't anticipate that at all. We didn't anticipate the boom of AI right now. I mean, some people may have a year or two before, but not to this
Not
extent.
more than that, for
And if
sure.
you look back at the big plans for companies in the last 30 or 40 years, they've all been rocked by developments nobody anticipated, right? So, you know, planning is way overrated, right? And figuring out how we manage uncertainty is something we can do, but it's
Hmm.
just not as simple and it doesn't sound as cool as just planning, right? So we can
Yeah,
do the
yeah.
plan even when it doesn't.
Absolutely well said. And I was going to ask this question, and I will still, but I think you've answered some of that. Is if you were to give your recommendation to employers today in terms of how to create that psychological safety
Mm,
for their employees, right?
yeah,
With everything that's coming, hey, employer, like we're seeing companies laying off tens of thousands of people in one shot. Am I going to be relevant?
yeah,
Like, and that plays a lot into how it
yeah,
impacts their work and the
yeah.
business, right? You've written about it a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think and it's interesting to start at downsizing because it's a great example of what the problem is. Employers, and by that I mean the top C-suite people running companies, believe lots of things which are just not true. One of them is that downsizing saves money, and there's never been a study that I know of that's shown that. But there are lots of studies that show that it doesn't. And the most recent ones show that if there's a downturn, the longer you could wait to cut, the better you do afterwards. And the reason for that is there's a rebound. And if you think about what happened with COVID, remember in
Sorry,
the,
repeat that. You're saying the longer you wait to cut, the
yes.
better you do.
Yes. And the reason is because when business comes back, as it did, you know, in 2021, remember the scramble to try to get people to work in restaurants and things, and companies couldn't open and they had to shrink their hours because they couldn't get enough people. But the companies that hung
Hmm.
on to their employees, they zipped up, right?
But
And
okay, but then you're assuming that then the company has that extra cash cushion to wait that long, right? Because a lot of it also comes down to profitability in that slack period.
well, that's right. That's an interesting question. Why are we downsizing? We're downsizing because business has completely gone away. If you look at the current downsizing going on now, the economy is doing really well, and yet we're still downsizing. Why is
Yes.
that? It's not because business is down. It's not
No.
because companies think going forward that they're going to be in trouble.
Yeah.
It's
They want the
because
bottom line to look better.
right now, and
Yeah.
they're playing to what investors are telling them, but they're
True.
going to pay a price for that, right? So if you think about Google, which put a bullet in its brand with its downsizing, it was the number one place that college students said they wanted to work in the whole world, even where Google employs nobody. And they spent a
Mm.
lot of time nurturing that brand. And then as soon as they did their downsizing, they got tons of negative publicity about that. And then they immediately announced their hiring plans after that. So it
Yeah.
was pretty clear, the layoffs were really just to soothe the investor pressure. And so, downsizing, keeping positions vacant, which is another thing we see companies doing a lot, they don't save money, right? They save maybe your current expenses, but they hit you on the other side. So I just wrote a book
Mm.
about this called Our Least Important Asset, which is basically about why companies manage human capital so poorly. And one of the reasons, which we see here, has to do with financial accounting, playing to financial interests in financial accounting, which has no role for human capital. There's no role for human capital in financial accounting. It doesn't exist.
Mm.
And financial accounting rules say that humans cannot be assets. Even if they're under contract to you, you have to own something for it to be an asset. We don't own people, our employees, so they can't be assets. They can't be valuable. So if you're trying to, as an investor, figure out the value of a tech company, you just can't do it. And the investors know this is crazy. If you want to invest in your employees, as we might say, by training and developing them, you can't do it because you can only invest in something that's an asset. So the money you're spending on training doesn't show up as an investment. It shows up as a current operating expense along with office supplies and things like that, right? So by playing to the investor interests, financial accounting, which sets the rules that investors use to judge you, you end up making really bad business decisions like
Sure.
turnover. We don't pay any
Yes.
attention to turnover costs. They're enormous, but investors don't see them, so we just kind of ignore them, right? So
Yeah.
it's a big longer term problem. And I would say the big problem is, back to your original question, can we persuade the leaders of companies who, believe me, because I talk to them frequently, know nothing about this stuff? They have no idea what turnover
Yeah.
costs are. They have no idea what downsizing does to their longer term profitability. Can we get the word to them? And I'm afraid human resource people have been afraid to make those cases. They think that they look weak if they say that. You have to
Yeah.
squeeze your human capital assets, and it doesn't work particularly well.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, I mean, and I feel like a lot of, I mean, I have a human resource team, and in the previous companies I worked, we always had it, and I always felt like a lot of their approach was reactive. Oh, I'm
Yeah,
just going to react to any change that happens in my company,
right, right.
rather than proactively making a shift. Because if I end up doing something that's a negative sentiment to the whole organization, I'd rather not do anything and not risk that.
Yes, I think that's right. That's a great, great point. And I think what you would hope they would do is be active rather than reactive and tell you, if you want to go down this line, we certainly can. Here are the pluses and minuses of it. And particularly with workforce planning, right? Um,
Yeah.
Workforce planning should be an active rather than reactive exercise. So here's where we're going to go with our business this next year. You should be able to get to them while they're still thinking about that and say,
Mhm.
to do that is going to require adding 100 salespeople who are qualified. I don't know how we're going to get them, right? So
Yeah.
go down that path, but it's not going to work particularly well. Are you sure you want to go down that path? Because we can't execute it, right?
Excellent. Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Concluding question. What's the end game with everything that you're working on, and have you achieved it? And tell us a little bit more of how that's gonna
Well,
pan.
the end game, is looking there. We have this retirement issue coming up. I mean, it's literally kind of an end game, which is right in front of us. We don't have mandatory retirement, but we have extremely powerful incentives to retire. I
Yeah,
think for us, there's an issue of what you think your contributions have been. We're individual contributors. Some of that is who's listening to you, right? And some
sure.
of that is about who your audience is. And I think, the the unpleasant thing, which has happened more recently in higher education, is that higher education has required people who want to be individual contributors with a big audience to really market, right? Social media,
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
and also
Market
under
design.
some pressure to say things which will get attention, even if they're not completely true. And those pressures are building. And
Sure.
I can't say they even existed maybe even 15 years ago. They were just not
Yeah.
noticeable. And now they are.
No,
And
yeah.
that's worrying, I think, because one of the things that we should be doing in higher education is we should be the trusted voices rather than the people who are looking after our own material interests,
Yeah.
to try to,
It's the added pressure, right, of a decade of declining enrollments and how that impacts the entire funnel of higher education. Like a lot of that could be attributed to that as well.
well, that they go together, don't they? Right? If you
Yeah.
think star faculty that are popular in the broader public, um, maybe that helps you get students and other sorts of things, right? So
Yeah.
it is discouraging because there is a tension between trying to say important things which are true and trying to say popular things which might not be completely true, right? There's a tension that's already there.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Cappelli, thank you so much. This has been a very insightful session and such free flowing in terms of just our thought process around education, workforce, how they're connected, the future. Thank you. It's been a pleasure chatting with you on our
Thank you.
podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Fabulous. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to EDU Unlocked with me, Ashish Fernando, and our guest for today, Dr. Peter Cappelli from UPenn. Thank you so much, everybody, and see you on the next podcast.